Proposition 7. Nomad existence has, for affects, the weapons of a war machine. A distinction can always be made between weapons and tools on the basis of their usage, destroying people or producing goods. But although this extrinsic distinction explains certain secondary adaptations of a technical object, it does not preclude a general convertibility between the two groups, to the extent that it seems very difficult to propose an intrinsic difference between weapons and tools. The types of percussion, as defined by André Leroy-Gowan, are found on both sides. Quote, "For ages on end, agricultural implements and weapons of war must have remained identical." End quote. Some have spoken of an ecosystem, situated not only at the origin, in which work, tools, and weapons of war exchange their determinations. It seems that the same machinic phylum traverses both, and yet we have the feeling that there are many internal differences, even if they are not intrinsic, in other words, logical or conceptual, and even if they remain approximate. As a first approximation, weapons have a privileged relation with projection. Anything that throws or is thrown is fundamentally a weapon, and propulsion is its essential moment. The weapon is ballistic. The very notion of the problem is related to the war machine. The more mechanisms of projection a tool has, the more it behaves like a weapon, potentially or simply metaphorically. In addition, tools are constantly compensating for the projective mechanisms they possess, or else they adapt themselves to other ends. It is true that missile weapons, in the strict sense, whether projected or projecting, are only one kind among others. But even handheld weapons require a usage of the hand and arm different from that of tools, a projective usage exemplified in the martial arts. The tool, on the other hand, is much more introjective. It prepares a matter from a distance in order to bring it into a state of equilibrium, or to appropriate it for a form of interiority. Action at a distance exists in both cases, but in one case it is centrifugal, in the other centripetal. One could also say that the tool encounters resistances to be conquered or put to use, while the weapon has to do with counterattack, to be avoided or invented. The counterattack is in fact the precipitating and inventive factor in the war machine, to the extent that it is not simply reducible to a quantitative rivalry or a defensive parade. Secondly, weapons and tools do not tendentially, approximately, have the same relation to movement, to speed. It is yet another essential contribution of Paul Virilio to have stressed this weapon-speed complementarity. The weapon invents speed, or the discovery of speed invents the weapon, the projective character of weapons being the result. The war machine releases a vector of speed so specific to it that it needs a special name. It is not only the power of destruction, but dromocracy, nomos. Among other advantages, this idea articulates a new mode of distinction between the hunt and war, for it is not only certain that war does not derive from the hunt, but also that the hunt does not promote weapons. Either war evolved in the sphere of indistinction and convertibility between weapons and tools, or it used to its own advantage weapons already distinguished, already constituted. As Virilio says, war in no way appears when man applies to man the relation of the hunter to the animal, but on the contrary, when he captures the force of the hunted animal and enters into an entirely new relation to man, that of war, enemy, no longer prey. It is therefore not surprising that the war machine was the invention of the animal-raising nomads. Animal breeding and training are not to be confused either with the primitive hunt or with sedentary domestication, but are in point of fact, the discovery of a projecting and projectile system. Rather than operating by blow violence, or constituting a violence quote-unquote once and for all, the war machine, with breeding and training, institutes an entire economy of violence, In other words, a way of making violence durable, even unlimited. A long quote here. Bloodletting, immediate killing, run contrary to the unlimited usage of violence, that is, to its economy. The economy of violence is not that of the hunter and the animal raiser, but that of the hunted animal. In horseback riding, one conserves the kinetic energy, the speed of the horse, and no longer its proteins, the motor, and no longer the flesh. Whereas in the hunter's aim was to arrest the movement of wild animality through systemic slaughter. The animal breeder sets about conserving it, and by means of training, the rider joins with this movement, orienting it and provoking its exhilaration. End quote. The technological motor would develop this tendency further, but, quote, horseback riding was the first projector of the warrior, his first system of arms, end quote. Whence becoming animal in the war machine? Does this mean the war machine did not exist before horseback riding in the cavalry? That is not the issue. The issue is that the war machine implies the release of a speed vector that becomes a free or independent variable. This does not occur in the hunt, where speed is associated primarily with the hunted animal. It is possible for this race vector to be released in an infantry without recourse to horseback riding. It is possible, moreover, for there to be horseback riding, but as a means of transportation, or even of portage, having nothing to do with the free vector. In any event, what the warrior borrows from the animal is more the idea of the motor than the model of the prey. He does not generalize the idea of the prey by applying it to the enemy. He abstracts the idea of the motor, applying it to himself. Two objections immediately arise. According to the first, the war machine possesses as much weight and gravity as it does speed, the distinction between the heavy and the light, the dissymmetry between defense and attack, the opposition between rest and tension. But it would be easy to demonstrate that phenomena of temporization and even of immobility and catatonia, so important in wars, relate in certain cases to a component of pure speed, and the rest of the time they relate to the conditions under which state apparatuses appropriate the war machine, notably by arranging a striated space where opposing forces can come to an equilibrium. It happens that speed becomes abstracted as the property of a projectile, a bullet or artillery shell, which condemns the weapon itself and the soldier to immobility. For example, immobility in the First World War. But an equilibrium of forces is a phenomenon of resistance, whereas the counterattack implies a rush or change of speed that breaks the equilibrium. It was the tank that regrouped all of the operations in the speed vector and recreated a smooth space for movement by uprooting men in arms. The opposite objection is more complex. It is that speed does indeed seem to be as much a part of the tool as of the weapon, and is no way specific to the war machine. The history of the motor is not only military, but perhaps there is too much of a tendency to think in terms of quantities of movement instead of seeking qualitative models. The two ideal models of the motor are those of work and free action. Work is a motor cause that meets resistances, operates upon the exterior, is consumed and spent in its effect, and must be renewed from one moment to the next. Free action is also a motor cause, but one which has no resistance to overcome, operates only upon the mobile body itself, is not consumed in its effect, and continues from one moment to the next. Whatever its measure or degree, speed is relative in the first case, absolute in the second, the idea of a perpetuum mobile. In work, what counts is the point of application of a resultant force exerted by the weight of a body considered as one, gravity, and the relative displacement of this point of application. In free action, what counts in the way is the way in which the elements of the body escape gravitation to occupy absolutely a non-punctuated space. Weapons and weapon handling seem to be linked to a free action model, and tools to a work model. Linear displacement from one point to another constitutes the relative movement of the tool, but it is the vortical application of a space that constitutes the absolute movement of the weapon. It is as though the weapon were moving, self-propelling, while the tool is moved. This link between tools and work remains obscured unless work receives the motor, or real definition we have just given it. The tool does not define work, just the opposite. The tool presupposes work. It must be added that weapons also obviously imply a renewal of the cause, an expending or even disappearance in the effect, the encountering of external resistances, a displacement of force, etc. It would be futile to credit weapons with a magical power, puissance, in contrast to the constraints of tools. Weapons and tools are subject to the same laws, which define precisely their common sphere. But the principle behind all technology is to demonstrate that a technical element remains abstract, entirely undetermined, as long as one does not relate it to an assemblage it presupposes. It is the machine that is primary in relation to the technical elements, not the technical machine itself, a collection of elements. But the social or collective machine, the machinic assemblage that determines what is a technical element at a given moment, what is its usage, extension, comprehension, etc. It is through the intermediary of assemblages that the phylum selects, qualifies, and even invents the technical elements. Thus, one cannot speak of weapons or tools before defining the constituent assemblages they presuppose and enter into. This is what we meant when we said that weapons and tools are not merely distinguished from one another in an extrinsic manner, and yet they have no distinctive intrinsic characteristics. They have internal and not intrinsic characteristics relating to the respective assemblages with which they are associated. What effectuates a free action model is not the weapons in themselves and in their physical aspect, but the war machine assemblage as the formal cause of the weapons. And what effectuates the work model is not the tools, but the work machine assemblage as the formal cause of the tools. When we say that the weapon is inseparable from a speed vector, while the tool remains linked to the conditions of gravity, we are claiming only to signal a difference between two types of assemblage, a distinction that holds even if in the assemblage proper to it, the tool is abstractly faster and the weapon abstractly more weighty. The tool is by essence tied to a genesis, a displacement and an expenditure of force whose laws reside in work, while the weapon concerns only the exercise or manifestation of force in space and time in conformity with free action. The weapon does not fall from the sky, and obviously assumes production, displacement, expenditure, and resistance. But this aspect relates to the common sphere of the weapon and the tool, and does not yet concern the specificity of the weapon, which only appears when force is considered in itself, when it is no longer linked to anything but the number, movement, space or time, or when speed is added to displacement. Concretely, a weapon as such does not relate to the work model, but to the free action model, with the assumption that the conditions of work are fulfilled elsewhere. In short, from the point of view of force, the tool is tied to a gravity displacement, weight-height system, the weapon to a speed perpetuum mobile system. It is in this sense that it can be said that speed in itself is a quote-unquote weapons system. The very general primacy of the collective and machinic assemblage over the technical element applies generally for tools as for weapons. Weapons and tools are consequences, nothing but consequences. It has often been remarked that a weapon is nothing outside of the combat organisation is bound up with. For example, hoplite weapons only existed by virtue of the phalanx as a mutation of the war machine. The only new weapons at the time, the two-handed shield, was created by this assemblage. The other weapons were pre-existent but in other combinations where they had a different function, a different nature. It is always the assemblage that constitutes the weapon system. The lance and the sword came into existence in the bronze only by virtue of the man-horse assemblage, which caused a lengthening of the dagger and pike and disqualified the first infantry weapons, the morning star and the battle-axe. The stirrup in turn occasioned a new figure of the man-horse assemblage, entailing a new type of lance and new weapons. And this man-horse stirrup constellation is itself variable, and has different effects depending on whether it is bound up with the general conditions of nomadism, or readapted later on to the sedentary conditions of feudalism. The situation is exactly the same for the tool. Once again, everything depends on an organisation of work, and variable assemblages of man, animal, and thing. Thus the heavy plough only exists as a specific tool in a constellation where long open fields predominate, where the horse tends to replace the ox as draft animal, where the land begins to undergo triennial rotation, and where the economy becomes communal. Beforehand, the heavy plough may well have existed, but on the margins of other assemblages that did not bring out its specificity, that left unexploited its differential character with the scratch plough. Assemblages are passional. They are compositions of desire. Desire has nothing to do with a natural or spontaneous determination. There is no desire but assembling, assembled, engineered desire. Agenson, agencer, machiner. The rationality, the efficiency of an assemblage does not exist without the passions that the assemblage puts into play, without the desires that constitute it as much as it constitutes them. Détienne has shown that the Greek phalanx was inseparable from a whole reversal of values, and from a passional mutation that drastically changed the relations between desire and the war machine. It is a case of man dismounting from the horse, and of the man-animal relation being replaced by a relation between men in an infantry assemblage that paves the way for the advent of the peasant soldier, the citizen soldier. The entire eros of war changes. A group homosexual eros tends to replace the zoosexual eros of the horseman. Undoubtedly, whenever a state appropriates the war machine, it tends to assimilate the education of the citizen to the training of the worker, to the apprenticeship of the soldier. But if it is true that all assemblages are assemblages of desire, the question is to know whether the assemblages of war and work, considered in themselves, do not fundamentally mobilize passions of different orders. Passions are effectuations of desire that differ according to the assemblage. It is not the same justice, nor the same cruelty, the same pity, etc. The work regime is inseparable from an organisation and a development of form, corresponding to which is the formation of the subject. This is the passional regime of feeling as, quote, the form of the worker, end quote. Feeling implies an evaluation of matter and its resistances, a direction, also quote-unquote meaning, to form and its developments, an economy of force and its displacements, an entire gravity. But the regime of the war machine is on the contrary that of affects, which relate only to the moving body in itself, to speeds and compositions of speed among elements. Affect is the active discharge of emotion, the counterattack, whereas feeling is an always displaced, retarded, resisting emotion. Affects are projectiles just like weapons, while feelings are interoceptive like tools. There is a relation between the affect and the weapon, as witnessed not only in mythology, but also in the chanson de geste and the chivalric novel, or novel of courtly love. Weapons are affects, and affects weapons. From this standpoint, the most absolute immobility, pure catatonia, are a part of the speed vector, are carried by this vector, which links the petrification of the act to the precipitation of movement. The knight sleeps on his mount, then departs like an arrow. Kleist is the author who best integrated these sudden catatonic fits, swoons, suspenses, with the utmost speeds of a war machine. He presents us with a becoming weapon of the technical element simultaneous to a becoming affect of the passional element, the Penthesilea equation. The martial arts have always subordinated weapons to speed, and above all to mental, absolute speed. For this reason, they are also the arts of suspense and immobility. The affect passes through both extremes. Thus, the martial arts do not adhere to a code as an affair of the state, but follow ways, voies, which are so many paths of the affect. Upon these ways, one learns to unsee, se desservir de weapons. One learns to unuse weapons, as much as one learns to use them, as if the strength, puissance, and cultivation of the affect were the true goal of the assemblage, the weapon being only a provisory means. Learning to undo things and to undo oneself is proper to the war machine, the not doing of the warrior, the undoing of the subject. A movement of decoding traverses the war machine, while overcoding soldiers, the tool to an organization of work and of the state. The tool is never unlearned. One can only compensate for its absence. It is true that the martial arts continually invoke the centre of gravity and the rules of displacement. That is because these ways are not the ultimate ones. However far they go, they are still in the domain of being, and only translate absolute movements of another nature into the common sense, those effectuated in the void, not in nothingness, but in the smooth of the void where there is no longer any goal, attacks, counterattacks, and headlong plunges. Still, from the standpoint of the assemblage, there is an essential relation between tools and signs. That is because the work model that defines the tool belongs to the state apparatus. It has often been said that people in primitive societies do not work, strictly speaking, even if their activities are very constrained and regulated, and neither does the man of war as such. The labours of Hercules assume submission to a king. The technical element becomes a tool when it is abstracted from the territory and is applied to the earth as an object. But at the same time, the sign ceases to be inscribed upon the body and is written upon an immobile, objective matter. For there to be work, there must be a capture of activity by the state apparatus, and a semiotization of activity by writing. Whence the activity between the assemblage's sign tools and signs of writing organization of work. Entirely different is the case of the weapon, which is an essential relation with jewellery. Jewellery has undergone so many secondary adaptations that we no longer have a clear understanding of what it is. But something lights up in our mind when we are told that metalworking was the barbarian or nomad art par excellence. And when we see these masterpieces of minor art, these fibulas, these gold or silver plaques, these pieces of jewellery, concern small movable objects which are not only easy to transport, but which pertain to the object only as object in motion. These plaques constitute traits of expression, of pure speed, carried on objects that are themselves mobile and moving. They do not enter into a relation of form-matter, but one of motif support, where the earth is no longer anything more than ground, where there is no longer even any ground at all, since the support is as mobile as the motif. They give colours the speed of light, turning gold to red and silver into a white light. They are attached to the horse's harnesses, the sheath of the sword, the warrior's garments, the handle of the weapon. They even decorate things only used once, such as the arrowhead. Regardless of the effort or toil they imply, they are of the order of free action, related to pure mobility, and not of the order of work with its conditions of gravity, resistance, and expenditure. The ambulant smith links metalworking to the weapon, and vice versa. Gold and silver have taken on many other functions, but cannot be understood apart from this nomadic contribution made by the war machine, in which they are not matters, but traits of expression appropriate to weapons. The whole mythology of war not only subsists in money, but is the active factor in it. Jewellery are the affects that correspond to weapons, that are swept up by the same speed vector. Metalworking, jewellery making, ornamentation, even decoration, do not form a writing, even though they have a power, puissance, of abstraction that is in every way equal to that of writing. Only this power is engineered, agencé, differently. In the case of writing, the nomads had no need to create their own system. They borrowed that of their sedentary imperial neighbours, who even furnished them with a phonetic transcription of their languages. Quote, metalworking is the barbarian art par excellence, filigrees and gold or silver plating. Scythian art, linked to a nomadic and warlike economy that simultaneously made use of and rejected commerce, reserved for foreigners, was oriented towards this decorative and luxury aspect. The barbarians had no need to possess or create a specific code. For example, in elementary picto-ideography, much less a syllabic writing system, which moreover would have been in competition with those used by their more advanced neighbours. In the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, the Scythian art of the Black Sea thus tended towards a graphic schematization of forms, which made it more a linear ornament than a proto-writing system. End quote. Of course, one may write on jewellery, metal plaques, or even weapons, but only in the sense that one applies a pre-existing writing system to these matters. The case of runic writing is more troubling, because its origins seem exclusively tied to jewellery, fibulas, elements of metalworking, small movable objects. The point is that in its early period, runic writing had only a weak communication value and a very restricted public function. Its secret character has led many to interpret it as magical writing. Rather, it is an affective semiotic, comprising in particular 1. Signatures, as marks of possession or fabrication. 2. Short war or love messages. Short war or love messages. It constitutes a text that is ornamental rather than scriptural. Quote, an invention with little utility, half aborted. End quote. A substitute writing. It only takes on the value of writing during a second period, when monumental inscriptions appear, with the Danish reform of the 9th century AD in connection with the state and work. It may be objected that tools, weapons, signs and jewellery in fact occur everywhere in a common sphere, but that is not the problem, any more than it is to seek an origin in each case. It is a question of assigning assemblages. In other words, of determining the differential traits according to which an element formally belongs to one assemblage rather than to another. It could also be said that architecture and cooking have an apparent affinity with the state, whereas music and drugs have differential traits which place them on the side of the nomadic war machine. It is therefore a differential method which establishes the distinction between weapons and tools. From at least 5 points of view: the direction, projection, introception; the vector, speed, gravity; the model, free action, work; the expression, jewellery, signs; the passional or desiring tonality, affect, feeling. Doubtless the state apparatus tends to bring uniformity to the regimes by disciplining its armies, by making them work a fundamental unit. In other words, by imposing its own traits. But it is not impossible for weapons and tools, if they are taken up by new assemblages of metamorphosis, to enter into other relations of alliance. It happens that the man of war sometimes forms peasant or worker alliances, but it happens more often that a worker, industrial or agricultural, will reinvent a war machine. Peasants made an important contribution to the history of artillery during the Hussite Wars, when Ziska armed mobile fortresses made from ox carts with portable cannons. A worker soldier, weapon tool, sentiment, affect, affinity marks the right time, however fleeting, for revolutions and popular wars. There is a schizophrenic taste for the tool that moves it away from work and towards free action, a schizophrenic taste for the weapon that turns it into a means for peace, for obtaining peace, a counterattack and a resistance at the same time. Everything is ambiguous, but we do not believe that Ernst Junger's analyses are disqualified by this ambiguity when he portrays the rebel as a trans-historical figure, drawing the worker on the one hand and the soldier on the other down a shared line of flight where one says simultaneously, "I seek a weapon," and "I am looking for a tool." Trace the line, or what amounts to the same thing, cross the line, pass over the line, for the line is only traced by surpassing the line of separation. Undoubtedly, nothing is more outmoded than the man of war. He has long since been transformed into an entirely different character, the military man, and the worker himself has undergone so many misadventures. And yet men of war reappear, with many ambiguities. They are all those who know the uselessness of violence, but who are adjacent to a war machine to be recreated, one of active revolutionary counterattacks. Workers also appear who do not believe in work, but who are adjacent to a work machine to be recreated, one of active resistance and technological liberation. They do not resuscitate old myths or archaic figures. They are the new figure of a trans-historical assemblage, neither historical nor eternal, but untimely. The nomad warrior and the ambulant worker. A sombre caricature already precedes them. The mercenary or mobile military instructor, and the technocrat or transhumanist analyst, the CIA and IBM. But a trans-historical figure must defend himself as much against old myths as against pre-established anticipatory disfigurations. Quote, "One does not go back to reconquer the myth. One encounters it anew when time quakes at its foundations under the empire of extreme danger." End quote. Martial arts and state-of-the-art technologies only have value because they create a possibility for bringing together worker and warrior masses to a new type. the shared line of flight of the weapon and the tool, a pure possibility, a mutation. There arise subterranean, aerial, submarine technicians who belong more or less to the world order, but who involuntarily invent and amass virtual changes of knowledge, virtual charges of knowledge and action that are usable by others. Minute, but easily acquired for new assemblages. The borrowings between warfare and the military apparatus, work and free action, always run in both directions, for a struggle that is all the more varied.